before we jump into questions, I wanted to know if you had like any immediate thoughts or things you wanted to discuss after playing.
If I would disclose contents of my heart, it's interesting because we had talked about how this gathering today, this session today, was kind of a little snapshot of what things have been like during quarantine in terms of that work. And there was even some brief discussion to clarify whether, I've noticed that my playing has changed during this time. But what I'm struck by, and what I know, is that when I play, it's best not to think about what's going to happen because it's usually wrong. And I usually am not aware of what is actually happening either during or afterwards. And so what I noticed emerged today, just between us and maybe Rick would see, was a uncanny continuity between this improvisation and the one I did last October in this very same place. There were a couple features which started to come up, and I couldn't resist but to say, there's that thing again. And a lot has transpired since then. And as I said, I thought that my playing had changed quite a bit. So it's interesting that there's a continuity through all that, which I think is...
It's interesting to talk about like not trying to think about when you're playing improvisation, for example. But there were some things that we could definitely hear that threaded it all together. And part of this interview is to like help listeners be oriented to what they're listening to.
Yeah.
So, for example, do you have any like specific motifs that you can recall that you played in October, or like what musically?
The specific thing that kind of became a character, because in October I also did a run through the week before of the whole program, and I did the entire program, including the improvisation, which opens the program as a 25-minute improvisation. And at that run through, there was, just to let you know, there was a toward the end, a repeated chord that kept repeating something like 20, 30 times repeated in a somewhat menacing way. There was a kinship to the end of Messiaen's Oiseaux Exotiques, but it was a lot more, there was something more, troubling about it. And the following week, when at the actual performance, that presented itself, and I thought it's still there. We got to do it again. It was a different chord, a different context, but something about it. It was like the same character cast in a new light. And there was a point in today's where I said to myself, I wonder now that I'm so much in the aura of that. I wonder if that thing is going to come back, and here it's supposed to come here. And it transformed into something, but there was eventually a chord which I began to repeat toward the end, which was much softer, but it was a reference in my mind, a little tip of the hat to that character. So that's the one thing. And there was something about the way things ended here also that was similar to that. I don't like to repeat myself or to try to do something again that would say, let's say, worked. I don't think it ever actually works. But that's different from there being something that is brewing that needs further development, even from one gig to the next. But just to clarify, I think in order to, especially in a music like what we heard, which I think is there's a discourse, there's a narrative. You have to create structure, you have to create meaning, and with music and without words, one of the things that you do is you repeat something, and that in some funny way gives it meaning.
Yeah.
Right. I could do anything. And you would say, well, that was an accident. But the minute I go, all of a sudden we've got a discourse going on. So in that sense, the repetition, which is internal to the piece, is integral to keeping myself engaged and moving the agenda forward. The unity that came at the end is talking about the fact that even though there's no prior preconceived design, that on the spot, I am, at the end of the day, always a composer. And there are things that I'm trying to bring together. And in that sense, very classical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the questions that I planned, I read that you studied under Fred Lerdahl, and he wrote the generative theory of tone music. Mm-hmm. And that's very important in the field of music cognition.
Yes.
So that's where this question, so a lot of it deals with like on the temporal, like horizontal plane, how things relate to each other, and how that creates expectations, intentions, and inferences for a listener, and therefore meaning. And
the prolongations of those expectations is,
So I thought it was interesting to ask somebody who was improvising, like how does that play out? And it's sort of like there was a large scale relationship between sounds.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
So also in my field, there's this separation when we're talking about emotions in music between perceiving emotions and feeling emotions as a listener. But the field is very listener based. We don't really get to ask composers. So when you were playing, was there something that you were either trying to convey, something you felt yourself, or something you really wanted a listener to experience?
Probably the short answer is no, but I'll clarify, because this is the way it generally works out for me, is that, and I think it's the best, it works the best. I get the direct thing which bypasses some things which usually I find either sluggish or not productive, not generative, to use that word. But I think that sometimes upon listening to what I did, I might say it seems to have this emotion, it seems to have that emotion, and very often very specific kind of thing, something that it strikes in me regarding my past experience or something or my present experience, very clear. But I can't say that I was always in touch with that. And vice versa, sometimes the different notes in the improvisation take on a certain meaning during the improvisation, which I attribute some kind of narrative to them. But after the fact, I don't know that either I or a listener would necessarily see that. But it does move the energy forward. Right? I think basically what I'm feeling during the improvisation, you might say there's this kind of feeling, or it sounded like he was feeling this. I'm feeling, I can't explain it except for some kind of bliss, basically. when certain notes relate to each other and produce a feeling which basically feels good. And I try to deepen that feeling.
Is that sort of bliss different from when you're playing a prepared piece? So like, can you get that sort of bliss when you're playing a prepared piece?
What do you think?
I would think it's different because it's something very, you can be very creative when you're playing something prepared, but it's a different sort of creativity when you're improvising.
Yeah.
So is that a yes? Okay.
I don't know. I'll have to get back to you. But it's to be less disingenuous, I think it's a central concern in my work.
Bliss.
So you kind of hit the nail on the head.
Cool. So I don't have much. I know you have great knowledge on counterpoint. You wrote your dissertation on 15th century practice. But from my limited knowledge, I know that improvisation then, or improvisation in many different periods had like different contrapuntal styles, and they were much more important or central to the improvisations. But in 2020, it's sort of all over the map. How does counterpoint influence the way you improvise, or does it influence the way you improvise?
Yeah, again, it's a terrific question for me because it's central to what I think about. And so it's hard not to say, let's talk about this for a few hours. But without trying to characterize what improvisations were like, by all accounts, Bach was an extraordinary improviser. It would have been great to see what he did on any given Sunday. And then this a bit ties in actually to the program that I had proposed to Rick for the performance this October. Actually, the performance last year, I believe, might have been in November, if I'm not mistaken. But the one for this October addresses some of these concerns because you have, first of all, an improvisation. I'll get to your question. You have an improvisation by myself, which, whatever that is, it's maybe in the same vein as what you heard. And there's a piece by Giacinto Scelsi, Italian composer, who the interesting thing about that is that much of his later work was improvised and then later transcribed by an amanuensis. And so bringing that, addressing the whole enterprise of notating something that was originally conceived that way actually goes back to your question of do you think you can rekindle that same original spirit? And it's something that I wanted to address and to and with it the whole can of worms it involves. The Usfolskaya the piece by Galina Usfolskaya that was on the program is a very interesting addition because it starts to get into what you're talking about. Her music is generally known to be, these are kind of like standard things, is that there's often a violence to it, an aggressiveness to it, which is its characteristic feature. What I wanted to bring out in this piece, which are the preludes, are actually that contrapuntal efficiency. And so there's something about the pieces that is extremely efficient in the same way Bach's contrapuntal procedure is. And there's something about the music which I can only characterize as completely musical, to such an extent that it's very hard for me to find an adjective to accurately describe the music because it's so distinctly and purely musical. And to sort of spotlight this, I added the three-part fugue from the musical offering, from Bach's musical offering, which, as legend goes, was originally an improvisation, which he later went back and turned into a composition. So all of these are central to things that I'm thinking about and trying to work through. As far as the distinct contrapuntal nature of these improvisations, counterpoint can be generalized also in the sense that there are multiple things going on. And in that sense, I feel there were different strands of thematic material which were simultaneously going and which maybe converged in some degree. The playing I've been doing in the past few months at home, which this turns out, as I said, to be less characteristic of, and more characteristic of the continuity between this and the last performance at the Italian Academy. But that playing seems to be more contrapuntal because there is distinct registers and also an efficiency. Sometimes there's only 3 notes happening at once and I'm creating a great deal of sound. So a lot of that is being done in improvisation, which is really just composing on the spot as far as I'm concerned, but in showing more of a contrapuntal spirit. Now, having said that, there's an ideal to which I believe counterpoint strives, and this happens even in Bach, as phenomenal as his improvising is. There is a sense where you the musical thought process begins with an idea, which is basically an idea which has several component parts which fit together in a contrapuntal unit. And this is the basic idea. So the ideal fugue, for example, has this property, which there are some examples, but maybe not even a purely ideal one. And the entire composition, or the process, or the creative process, consists of shifting the relationship of these component parts, whether it's moving one slightly up, moving one down, or putting one below, putting one here, and this is what's called invertible counterpoint. And in doing this, you're trying things out and seeing, oh, this sounds like something. So each one, without actually changing ever the component parts, you're getting different sounds. And ultimately, hopefully, some meaning. And to even take it further, a kind of self-realization by looking at the different, almost like searching for what happens when you move this up, move this down. It's much more procedural, but it can be just as intuitive also. So how this intertwines with improvising, again, is just so current to what I'm thinking about these days that I have to provide some work before I can make any statements about that. But it's a very interesting question.
So how has the pandemic affected your practice? I guess you sort of...
I can also say, first off, I think my practice, my creativity, I regard it as something metabolic. So in that sense, it's been affected as much or as little as any of my other autonomic functions. That is to say, it hasn't been affected. But as far as the grist for the mill that goes into this metabolic process, if you have a consistent practice, that consists of any current events that are happening, of which one is the pandemic, and everything around it. And there's been a lot of other things that have been going on these days. But there are also things that these current things stir up from your own past experience. And then anything that's part of your inner psychic life that mixes into this, and in working you make things happen, or you bring things to expression. And in that sense, the basic functionality of my practice hasn't changed, but it has been informed by a lot of things. And by all accounts, I've done my best to stay safe and well. It's been a very productive time, if only because there's been a lot to work through.
Does it affect your musical aesthetics, like the pandemic, bombshell news cycles, or is it sort of more separate?
I don't know that I espouse any given musical aesthetics. Maybe music.
Style that you play, or how you improvise.
I might call it because I'm open to anything in terms of aesthetic, and we'll try if it seems relevant to embrace it, and if it doesn't seem relevant, I would try to see in what sense it could be relevant, and by expanding my sense of myself. But as far as I could probably speak about an ethic. A musical ethic, and in that sense, there's been certain things that it has validated. Certainly the immediacy and almost primacy of what we call improvisation, but to me, which has a directness, which is really composition, and the convergence of those two things into one unified activity, which is the goal and is the thing which you try to refine as much as you can. That has been affirmed, if only because of the limitations that have been imposed because of the restrictions. You have to find a way to continue creating as an artist, and this is one of the things I've found a way to do.
There's like sort of a myth about how the world affects composers sometimes, and how like it goes directly into your work in ways that are not just practical, but like even like rock and roll singers, for example, which if something's going on in the world, it reflects in their music, and they talk about popular topics. So that's why I bring up the question. I wonder if it makes its way into the music. And
I think it does. I think it's a tricky thing. It's almost like when you said you heard an ascending thing and then it went up. How do you know that that's not something you put on it? Maybe it was there. I don't remember it, but I was clearly doing it more than once. And on top of that, I did it at the end too. So it was clearly there. I mean, I'm not saying you're not listening. You are, because there was something there. But I generally go about it this way, which is just my way, which I think is very productive, and probably the conclusion I come to, is that I, again, try to be receptive to everything that's going on around me and take it in. And then when I work, I just do.
You don't think about it
Do,
specifically.
and you know, sometimes you see it's there, it's all there, but it's not an a priori thing. And you know, I don't consider my work to be political beforehand. I think it's apolitical, but in the sense that I am receptive to everything and I'm not trying to block anything out. I think the sentiment somehow comes through. But I think it's important to just be consistently working, because, you know, if one day something you do does not relate to that, that should also be allowed to come out.
Is there any way that you use music for joy during all of this? Maybe for recommendation for people or something?
Making it or listening to it?
Any way with music. Or if you have music that you think we should be listening to for joy.
I don't know if I'm reading into it, but sometimes we have a need, and the idea is that maybe music could meet that need, right? So I'm just, before we, because joy is one thing, but there's also solace, you know, and I don't know if listening to music and just sort of crying your heart out constitutes joy. But
it could.
It could, right?
There's actually
see,
research on it.
I think music, both for the musician and for the listener, involves listening. So it just would amount maybe to sort of quieting oneself down and just listening. If you're at an instrument, even if you're a non-musician, to press something on the instrument and listen to the life of that tone as it goes and decays. And I believe it will bring you some joy. And you might choose, based on either an ethical or aesthetical bent, to play a certain successive note based on that. And this isn't about making a discourse. This is just about sort of cultivating that feeling of responding to the tones. I believe those vibrations will bring you some sense of peace, joy. As far as listening, I might invite people to try to find a way to make their own sounds, because I think live sounds have a certain value to them. But also, maybe a recommendation is to, if you think of a piece that you might be curious about, to try to listen to the entire thing rather than the first minute or so.
Thank you. That's very apt for 2020.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.